JFK U.S. History, Lesson 37, John F. Kennedy and the New Frontier. As we discussed in our previous lessons, the Eisenhower administration, concluding the Eisenhower 50s, was going to be a time of economic prosperity, some economic growth and stability, and an era of standing up to the Soviets with a new-look foreign policy that involved concepts such as brinkmanship and massive retaliation. John Kennedy is going to come into the White House in 1960, winning a very, very narrow election over Richard Nixon, Eisenhower's vice president, and is going to quite consciously try to take the mantle of being a younger man, and younger man representing a new era. We're seeing, starting with Dwight Eisenhower, every president for the next 20 to 30 years would have been eligible to have served in World War II. But they'll serve in different capacities. Those different capacities would also kind of affect their worldviews. Whereas Dwight Eisenhower was a commanding general of all armed forces in Europe for most of his tenure. In other words, at the highest levels. John Kennedy was a junior grade officer serving on the front lines in the Pacific. So he saw the war from a very different angle, the angle of more of the troops being deployed and involved. But he's someone who had served, and we're going to see that true with many of the people that follow afterwards. And as such, he was very conscious of the fact that as a younger man than Eisenhower, a new generation, as he felt it, a generation that he said was tempered by war, had seen things in the Second World War, had fought in Korea, had dealt with communists, had dealt with Nazis as people coming up, had come up as younger men through the trials of the Depression, as this entire generation he represented was doing, as he felt it in many ways, was going to come in and bring a new youth, a new can-do spirit, a new sense of optimism to the White House. And that Americans would pay any price and bear any burden in the struggle for liberty and freedom. And the famous line, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, was going to instill a whole generation of Americans, of young Americans, with the fuel of youthful idealism. This, in many ways, is part of the mythology of Camelot that you saw labeled for Kennedy's administration, the romance that had gone along with this young man in a hurry and all the sort of the things that he was going to have policies he wanted to implement through his administration to bring out the best in the young Americans around him who, at this point in time, still very much were coming out of the Eisenhower Happy Days 50s, had a lot of trust in their government and institutions, in the media, and the things that they were being told and the things that they thought and believed. The next couple of lessons, we'll see that severely tested and challenged. But in the beginning, it's a time of trying to make the world a better place and using American resources to do this with an unshakable faith that anything that the American foreign policy establishment and government was going to try to do was, by extension, going to help make the world a better place. It was in this environment that the concept or notion of the Peace Corps was established in 1961. Part of Kennedy's program of what he called the New Frontiers. Americans were emerging on this new stage to do these new things. The Peace Corps was sending Americans to undeveloped nations overseas to try to use their knowledge and expertise to help those countries and advance their standard of living and advance the cause of their people and the qualities of their lives. Alliance for Progress was in many ways sort of labeled or billed as it was going to be a Marshall Plan for Latin America. It never quite turned out to be what it was billed to be in that way, but the idea was to put some $20 billion into Latin American economies to sort of stimulate their economic and social reforms. It was in many ways an advancement of the good neighbor policy beyond merely diplomatic things and the non-sending of gunboats and Marines. That was the idea behind it. Specifically, though, you're entering an era where you still have an awful lot of prosperity. And what Kennedy is going to do to try to maintain and keep this prosperity going is he's going to try to face down the steel industry over prices, trying to keep inflationary pressures down. He's also going to push for a tax cut in order to stimulate the economy, put more money into people's hands, and allow them to spend it. And he's also going to, in many ways, advance the space race as part of the military-industrial complex in this global struggle for outer space, interstellar supremacy against the Soviet Union. The space race is sort of a proxy for the Cold War. We'd said the Cold War was war by other means. This is one of those means that becomes competition. The Olympic Games throughout all these entire eras are now going to be viewed through the prism of the East versus the West, the communists versus the democracies, and medal counts are going to be kind of a way of keeping score as well over national superiority and supremacy and way of life. As we'd seen in the 1950s, civil rights and the equal rights movement had sort of been this undercurrent we'd seen underneath what seemed to be a very placid time when it was a tranquil society of consensus. It really wasn't. You'd seen these issues, this dynamic, this undercurrent of pressure for social change. This pressure is only going to increase under the Kennedy administration, and really increased much beyond that into becoming one of the central tenets, the central elements of American domestic discussion and foreign policy, or domestic discussion and internal policy in the 1960s. It will not become something that can be ignored. It'll be too big to ignore. It'll be one of the central elements, along with the Vietnam War, that are going to be discussed in America's dinner tables and policy discussions and governments as well throughout this whole era. We'd last left the civil rights movement with the nonviolent movement, the bus boycotts in Montgomery, and additionally we'd seen a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee establishing and coordinating these sit-ins to kind of integrate lunch counters and facilities within the South. This has taken a step further then as they try to integrate bus and train transportation lines with the Freedom Riders of the 1960 through 1962-63 period, whereby you would have white volunteers would sit in the black section on public transport and private commercial transport like bus lines, train lines, and blacks would sit in the white section. And what you had then is white activists, white supremacist activists throughout the South who would then find out about these Freedom Riders and where they're going and would try to disrupt or stop the trips from taking place. In some instances, even going so far as to firebomb buses and try to prevent these integrated buses from being able to transport their personnel, their American citizens throughout the South. Ultimately, U.S. Marshals would be called in under Kennedy to try to protect these Freedom Riders and allow them to have this right to travel on these buses unfettered. And similarly speaking, we see federal force being used in places like James Meredith at Ole Miss. James Meredith in 1962 attempted to become the first African-American student to enroll in what had been the all-white public university, the University of Mississippi. He was initially denied, and then federal troops were sent to secure his admission. And the community, which had outsiders, white supremacist outsiders, had also come into the community, and it resulted in about a day to 2 days of violence and protest and rioting on that campus, with numerous injuries to both federal forces and the protesting students and the protesting outsiders who'd come into the area. Similarly, the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, stood in the registration door at the University of Alabama and denied admission to an African-American student attempting to apply as well. Once again, federal troops under Kennedy were deployed to the South, to the University of Alabama campus, and this integration was attained through the strength of the strength and might of the federal government. So we're seeing significant local pushback, and all this time, remember, John Kennedy is a Democrat, as was Harry Truman, who had been pushing for civil rights. We're seeing real strains in whether or not the South is going to stay a solidly Democratic region of the country or not. These strains are what are eventually going to have it shift or flip its alliances to the Republican Party, and the South will be lost to Democrats for a generation within about a year or two under the policies of Lyndon Johnson, moving more into this area. This activism under the Kennedy administration ultimately culminates with Martin Luther King's March on Washington, which you've all in your courses discussed, the I Have a Dream speech. 250,000 people congregate on the Washington Mall and demanding quicker action from Congress and the president to advance this issue of civil rights. So notice what had started with small-scale local protests, bus boycotts, nonviolent protests from churches and students, now grows into what's increasingly a regional or national movement by the 1960s, which makes it this thing that becomes too big to ignore in many ways, and it becomes a more and more dominant topic of discussion and conflict in America as this era moves forward.